HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Light in the Dark, The Hidden Legacy of Adult Children of Sex Addicts, by Kenneth M. Adams, Ph.D., Mary E. Meyer, Ph.D., LMFT, and Culle L. Vande Garde LCSW. Read by Anne Sprinkle and Derek Dysart. Publisher's Note: this audiobook contains references to material present in the print and e-book editions of the book. Family dysfunction rolls down from generation to generation like a fire in the woods, taking down everything in its path until one person in one generation has the courage to turn and face the flames. That person brings peace to their ancestors and spares the children that follow. Terry Real. Forward. For those of us with the legacy of sex addiction in the families in which we grew up, we know all too well the devastation, destruction, and heartache this addiction can create for the family. As a child of a parent with sex addiction, I too saw the destruction and wrestled with the trauma and chaos it brought to me and those I love. As a clinician many years later, I have seen these patterns of trauma and devastation in the many families I have treated. And unfortunately, when sex addiction is discovered, the children are greatly impacted, yet rarely receive support or trauma therapy. Many of those children grow up to be adults who still carry unresolved wounding and pain. ACSAs, adult children of sex addicts, are often left feeling they are carrying their parents' secrets and shame, and feel that they cannot tell anyone about the hidden legacy of sex addiction in their family. It is time to end the silence about the pain that we, as ACSAs, experience, and to recognize that we too have been impacted and need treatment and support. The personal stories, provided by the authors Ken, Mary, and Culle, that open this book are rife with shame. Shame that is all too common in the lives of ACSAs. Unfortunately, the shame that we ACSAs feel has kept us quiet for far too long. Unlike adult children of alcoholics, drug addicts, and the mentally ill, issues where social shaming has decreased drastically over the past half-century, ACSAs have chosen to suffer in silence, mostly because sexual issues are still taboo, and sex addiction is still so misunderstood. So, rather than seeking relief by talking about our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, our shame has kept us in the closet, so to speak. Our reasoning seems to be, if you knew about my sex addiction lineage, you would think about me differently. You would view me as damaged, unworthy, and unlovable. Sex and porn addiction is so thoroughly stigmatized that it still flies under the radar, much as we saw with alcoholism and drug addiction 100 years ago. In other words, sex addiction is viewed as a moral failing, a weakness, and something to be ashamed of, rather than a maladaptive coping mechanism, which ultimately is what all addictions are. Because of this, sex addicts themselves, with very few exceptions, keep their problem under wraps even while they are in recovery, and their families often keep things even more under wraps. Sadly, this leaves ACSAs with very few resources and very little support. Nearly always, we walk through life ruled by our shame and negative core beliefs. Many, maybe most of which have absolutely nothing to do with us. They are, as Ken, Mary, and Culle noted in their introduction and elsewhere in this book, what psychologists refer to as carried shame, In other words, the burden of shame that ACSAs carry and that drives so much of our thinking and behavior, even as adults, is not entirely ours. But still, we carry it, and it can impact every aspect of our lives. The good news is that we needn't do this. Like adult children of alcoholics and drug addicts, we can talk about our situation with others, in particular with other ACSAs, learning from them while also helping them. In time and together, we can overcome the shame and negative thinking wrought by the knowledge of and the emotional impact of our parents' sexual addiction. We can learn that we no longer need to hide our parents' secrets and carry shame that does not belong to us. It is important to note here that ACSAs are not the same as adult children of alcoholics. Though similar in many ways, the shame we carry and the negative core beliefs we develop are different. Thus, our problematic adult life behaviors are also different. Because our parents carried sexual secrets, we often do the same. Because our parents struggled with their relationships, we often feel caught in the middle with divided loyalties. Because we were raised in a sexualized household, we may have received either overly permissive or overly shameful messages about sex and relationships, messages that continue to color our thinking even as adults. Worst of all, we may inadvertently convey these harmful behaviors and messages to our own children, even if we are not ourselves addicted. That is why this book is so important. After decades of trying to get whatever I could from the teachings of ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and similar adult children programs and books, there is finally a book that speaks to ACSAs directly. I am very proud of Ken, Mary, and Culle. As someone who has shared my own personal story in many venues, I know that it takes incredible courage. But the validation that ACSAs will experience when hearing stories like their own will be invaluable. I'm very grateful to Ken, Mary, and Culle for putting themselves out there and ending the silence so others can also start their healing journey. Their bravery will impact listeners on a very deep level. That alone is enough to make this book a must-listen. I also can't thank them enough for their extensive and accurate presentation of what it's like to be an ACSA and the work we need to do to heal. First and foremost, of course, they have validated the trauma experienced by children of sex addicts, the conflict of the parents, the role or roles that we get forced into, the split allegiance we feel, not to mention the confusion and fear we experience. The identification of the characteristics of ACSAs is on point. For those of us who've searched for help previously via Adult Children of Alcoholics and elsewhere, we know that, although we are similar in many ways to ACOAs, we are not the same. We do not share all of the same characteristics, and our journey toward overcoming our underlying trauma and harmful adult life behaviors does not entirely mirror the journey of ACOAs. This book also recognizes our rights and responsibilities. First and foremost, the fact that we must pursue the very specific help we need as ACSAs, not only to heal ourselves, but to prevent ourselves from passing the shame of sexual addiction on to the next generation. We need therapeutic support and peer-focused support that fully understands and focuses on the impact of sexual addiction, knowing that impact is just not the same as with other addictions. Without this assistance, we will continue to suffer, and our children may also suffer. My father titled his first book Out of the Shadows, and this book could easily share that title. Only this time, it is the children of sex addicts rather than the actual addicts who are exiting the dark recesses of shame and entering the healing light of recovery. It's about time, too. In fact, we ACSAs are past due for ending the silence and speaking openly about our lives and experiences. For me, it is an unbelievable honor to write the foreword for this much-needed book. For one thing, Ken, Mary, and Culle are valued and highly respected colleagues and clinicians. They are also, like my father when he wrote Out of the Shadows, incredibly brave in pushing themselves and their stories to the forefront. Best of all, they've not done this for glory or to further their already stellar reputations. They've done it to help others with similar backgrounds, thinking, and issues. I have no doubt that through this book and work to come, they will achieve exactly that. Dr. Stephanie Carnes.
Introduction. Adult children who grew up with a parent who had a sexual addiction are left confused, ashamed, and mistrustful regarding the feelings and boundaries surrounding sex, love, and intimacy. Because of the inappropriate sexual behavior by a parent and the subsequent impact of betrayal of the other parent, these adults carry sexual secrets, have divided loyalties, and are often caught in the middle of their parents' struggles. Having witnessed, or known of, affairs, walked in out of parent masturbating or viewing pornography, received extreme or shameful messages regarding sexuality or gender, experienced sexualized remarks about their bodies, been neglected as a result of the addiction, or been exposed to extreme moral values, either too permissive or shaming, these adult children of sex addicts, or ACSAs, struggle with their sexuality and longings for love. The burden of shame that they carry is not theirs. This book is written for ACSAs who long to unburden themselves of this shameful legacy and embrace sexuality and intimacy without the intrusion or constraints from the past. ACSAs have not had their stories told in any significant way in the recovery literature. Their shame and struggle has often been wedged under various umbrellas of identification: adult children of alcoholics, love avoidant, codependent, sex addict, love addict, and others. In order to give ACSAs their own working narrative and to validate their experience, we have stayed away from referencing other models or authors of related topics. We provide references in the bibliography section found in the print and ebook versions of this book for those who wish to pursue further exploration. We do borrow the self-help formatting made popular from the Adult Children of Alcoholics, or ACOA, literature, characteristics, role identification, and recovery. However, we see the characteristics and roles of ACSAs as significantly different from the ACOA literature. For example, the hero or responsible child identified in the ACOA family is more specifically the moral hero and champion in the ACSA family system. Our observations come from the hundreds of ACSAs that we have seen and treated in our practices over many decades. In addition, we were guided by a previous list of adult children of sex addicts characteristics identified by Hunter in 1997. Also, we do not enter the debate as to whether sex can become addictive or not. We align with the growing recognition and evidence that there are individuals who cannot control or stop their compulsive sexual behavior despite the negative consequences that follow. One of the most significant consequences is the shameful legacy left for the children parented by these addicts. The stories and experiences of the ACSAs attest to the reality that sex addiction is real. No individual story we tell in the book is any one client's experience. The stories we present are all composites of the many stories we have heard from the ACSAs we have worked with. Any resemblance to someone's actual family story is merely coincidental and a reflection of the common themes in ACSA's stories. Our family examples are heterosexual, with the sex addict being male. This has been our primary clinical experience, and we wanted to stay true to what we have observed over our careers. However, it is important to note that women can also be the sexually addicted parent with similar impacts on the children described in our book. Also, same-gender couples with families, where one parent is a sex addict, may produce the type of ACSA characteristics and roles we detail. As same-gender couples increasingly emerge as parents, ACSA voices from these families will need to be heard. In addition, the cultural shaming same-gender parents experience may also play a role in inherited shame passed on to the children. ACSAs who are LGBTQ+ or identify as non-binary people will need to sort for themselves the characteristics and roles we describe as they relate to their specific circumstances. This way, they can more specifically determine the ways in which their parents' sex addiction have impacted their own unique situations. In time, the voices of LGBTQ+ and non-binary people who are ACSAs will add to and enrich our understanding of the impact of a parent's sex addiction. Critical to our book is the concept of intergenerational trauma, whereby one does not need to be directly exposed to trauma to have its impact passed on from a previous generation that was directly affected. Children of Holocaust survivors have been extensively studied and show evidence of the trauma resulting from their parents' horror, even though they were not directly exposed to the Holocaust themselves. Hypervigilance, mistrust, numbing, depersonalization, aloofness, anxiety, and depression are some of the symptoms noted in second-generation trauma survivors. And there is some suggestion that the third generation may also be impacted. In the case of this sexually addicted family, intergenerational trauma is transmitted through the legacy of carried sexual shame. ACSAs, being the direct trauma victims of the inappropriate sexual behavior and betrayals, pass on to their offspring the sexual shame they themselves inherited. For example, an ACSA who has witnessed a parent's affair or lived with constant fighting between the parents over the addict's compulsive pornography use may become controlling and vigilant regarding sexual matters and messages toward their own children. This next generation, not having been directly exposed to the sex addict's inappropriateness, feels a confusing and unwelcome shamefulness regarding their own natural sexual curiosity. This second generation, in turn, may become avoidant or permissive sexually as a result of the trauma of intergenerational sexual shame. Our hope is that not only will this book unburden the ACSA, but protect a next generation from the impact of sexual shame. We feel the best way to invite ACSAs to unburden their legacy of sexual shame is by helping them identify and clarify their own stories. We start with sharing ours. The first 3 chapters tell each of our stories of growing up in sexually addicted families and the journeys we took to find our way. The subsequent chapters identify the ACSA's characteristics, roles, and recovery that point toward the freedom and joy they rightfully deserve. Ken, Mary, and Culle. Chapter 1. A Shameful Legacy I Did Not Ask For. Ken's Story. The unexpected mail from my uncle contained an accompanying note inside. Kenny, I thought you should have this letter that came to me. It's about your father. We always knew he was troubled, so I am not surprised by the contents. I hope it is not too disturbing. The letter was from a woman who claimed to be my father's daughter. She stated that in searching for her biological father, she came upon my uncle. My father had been deceased for 20 years, so his brother was the closest person she could find, given that this daughter was a secret, the result of one of my father's many extramarital affairs. Shocked but not particularly surprised, due to the rumors over the years of him fathering another child early in our family life, I sat down to take it all in. At first, wanting no part of the painful memories of my father's betrayals, I felt angry with my uncle for sending it. I quickly realized it was not my uncle with whom I was angry, but my father. According to the dates in her letter, I would have been about 10 when she was born. I thought back to that time in our family life, and it hit me hard. It was a time when my father was particularly rejecting and dismissive. He wouldn't come home many nights. He would walk out in the middle of holiday dinners, saying he had to go someplace, and he would excessively berate my mother, my brothers, and me. Like the click of a combination lock, the pieces came together, and I began to cry. I felt like that rejected 10-year-old boy all over again. I had no doubt. In rejecting us, he had left the house to be with his affair partner during the pregnancy and the subsequent birth of this daughter. My name is Ken. I am an adult child of a sexually addicted parent, my father. Having now said that, I feel the immediate shame I have carried most of my life for the legacy of my father's sexual secrets and addictive behaviors. The shame buried itself in me, became my own. I have spent the better part of my life reacting to and defending against that shame. Even now, I am reluctant to share my family's story in any revealing detail because of the shamefulness I feel. Yet, I have learned during my own healing journey that through sharing, I am freed from the burden of shamefulness that is not mine and the legacy I did not ask for. Long before I read the letter from my father's illegitimate daughter, I had been impacted by his sexual behavior many times. At the age of 6, I witnessed my father with another woman during a time my mother was hospitalized for depression, which I now know was caused by her trauma as a result of my father's infidelities and alcoholism. Overwhelmed and confused, I took on a lasting and shameful imprint, knowing he was betraying my mother. I remember feeling sick in my stomach and protective of my mother. While not understanding fully what being loyal meant, I knew what he was doing was wrong and hurtful. He demanded that I keep his secret. I was angry with him and frightened. What I did not know then, but understand more clearly now, was that I, too, felt I had betrayed my mother by not telling her. When I was 9, a similar incident witnessing my father's sex addiction occurred after going to work with him one Saturday. What started out as a proud moment working with my dad turned into yet another shameful and confusing time. He took me to a Chinese restaurant for a meal, and we sat down at a table with the waitress when he began being amorous with her in front of me. The only reason he stopped was because the waitress stopped him after she saw the apparent shock on my face. Again, he demanded I keep quiet, and again I felt I was keeping secrets from my mother and was complicit in his affairs. For years, Chinese food made me ill, and I could not eat at a Chinese restaurant until later in my adulthood and after years of therapy. Throughout my entire childhood and youth, my home was a constant source of conflict due to my father's suspected and known infidelities. At night, I would hear my parents fighting about his inappropriate sexual behavior. They would also fight when he would not come home at night, my mother, no doubt, keenly and painfully aware of his whereabouts. He would deny, blame, yell, and create such a conflict that my mother would give up the attempt to confront him, and we would move into a code of silence and normalization regarding his behavior. By the time I was 9, I did not believe that kindness, love, or joy were possible. These were all casualties of my father's sex addiction. All these incidents made it difficult to want to approach girls for a date in high school, as I always felt it was bad to be interested. My attraction seemed shameful for some reason. Unknowingly, the shame I was feeling then was linked to my father. I spent years being confused by my sexual interest, which left me feeling drawn but hesitant. I had not yet realized that my feelings were occurring in the shadow of my father's addicted and twisted behavior. Fortunately, the shame didn't keep me from having a loving experience with my girlfriend in my last year of high school, which felt innocent and sweet rather than shameful and confusing. While this high school romance did not survive the emerging carried dysfunction and shame of my family, it was nonetheless an oasis in the desert of lost love for me, leaving me always grateful. Also, gaining traction throughout the years was the pity and sorrow I felt for my mother from watching her pain and depression. She would stare out the kitchen window, which allowed her a view of the main road to our house, waiting for my father's car to pull up in the driveway. I would plead with her to make dinner or take care of my brothers and me, but she often seemed frozen in her worry and preoccupation. I would try to make her happy, a role that shouldn't have been mine, but I felt compelled to fill it. I got good grades, would bring her flowers, and one time I even brought a puppy home for her that I'd found abandoned on the side of the road. On the surface, these all were sweet gestures, but they hid the terrible guilty bind of having to be responsible for my mother. She made no effort to inform me that it was not my job to make her happy. What made matters worse is that my mother would take advantage of my sorrow for her. I declared loyalty and love to her that was not mine to declare or make up for. I felt guilt when I wasn't tending to her. She would turn to me to complain of her loneliness and to rage about my father and what a bad man he was. She would have me call his workplace and bars to check up on him, not giving any apparent thought to the impact on me. When I was a teen and wanted to be with friends and get out of the house, she would call and check on me. I felt embarrassed. My mother's calls became a running joke with my friends. Also, when I wanted to stay out late with them, she would fly into a rage and accuse me of being just like your father. By my late teens, all I wanted to do was get away from her and my father. What I didn't know then, and do now, is that my mother tried to control me in order to counter her helplessness over control of my father's sex addiction. Of course, this only added to my confusion and sense of shame. My parents became the bookends of a story that I wanted no part of and did not ask for. They were co-conspirators in a family system that had become filled with deceit, neediness, and shame. Just before I turned 18, through sheer force of will, I finally was able to leave the house. Relieved, I had hoped to put the painful legacy of my family behind me. It wasn't until my mid to late 20s, after a number of failed relationships, depression, addictions, and anxiety, that it became clear I hadn't. A friend, who I'd also been dating, suggested it would be better to see a therapist rather than dating her. It wasn't what I had in mind, but she gave me a card for a therapist, and I instinctively knew I needed to call. After I told the therapist my troubles, her first question was your father an alcoholic? I thought, how did she know? I am convinced that my friend and that call saved my life. It began my now lifelong journey of healing and recovery. My first step in healing was getting therapy and support for adults who had grown up in alcoholic families. Attending groups for adults who grew up in alcoholic families was very helpful. It was there I found a home for my story. It helped tremendously to share the feelings and experiences I had long kept secret about my father's alcoholism. As much as the groups helped me, I noticed when I risked sharing about my father's sex addiction, there was little return of similar stories. I couldn't imagine I was the only one whose alcoholic parent was also a sex addict.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?